anti-Putin coalition Stop Fascism in Russia. We'll be talking with Yosef Zisels, head of Association of Jewish Organizations and Communities of Ukraine, and German Obuchiv, chairman of the Anti-War Forum of Political Prisoners of the USSR and countries of the Warsaw Pact. Today, our country is interested. The country is interested in stopping Putin's aggression and is interested in establishing the coalition Stop Fascism in Russia. Good afternoon. My colleague is German Obuchiv from the Times of the Soviet Union, requested me to talk at this briefing and describe the picture of fascist and neo-Nazist movements in Russia which participate actively in Russian aggression in the east of Ukraine. First of all, I would like to say that use of ultra-nationalistic, fascist and neo-Nazi groups is so typical for relations between Russia and Ukraine for a long time. So under the influence of Russian political technologists in 2004, when we had the Orange Revolution, they were using provocations and propaganda technologies which were indicating that opposition and its candidate Viktor Yushchenko are fascist candidates, and they want to create in Ukraine the neo-Nazi state. That was used not very powerfully, unlike this year, but even then it impressed, first of all, the experts, for who that was the new technology in Russian-Ukrainian relations. Secondly, that technology, which was led by Viktor Medvedchuk, the head of the presidential administration, impressed the average citizens and many representatives of national minorities, Jewish minority especially, were intimidated by that propaganda and were not voting for Viktor Yushchenko. I remember these times very well because in 2004 from Maidan and on Channel 5 I was addressing the national minorities of Ukraine, but that did not influence their fear. And that time in 2013, when we had a new Maidan, we were ready, our experts were ready to use the propaganda templates and provocations at the background of fascist, neo-fascist sources. Russia, for more than 20 years, has been having a very wide system of different neo-fascist and ultra-nationalist organizations, which show themselves especially in, for example, relations with Georgia, with Moldova, with Ukraine in the recent years. The most famous organization out of those neo-Nazi groups is the so-called Русское национальное единство, Russian National Unity, led by Barkashov. That's a famous organization that has been in existence since the beginning of the 90s, and they have their representatives all over Russia. They had some ideological success in the beginning of the 90s. Then there was some period when they were not active. Now they are very active in the battles that are going on in the east of Russia. This organization has a widespread system of propaganda points in Moscow, St. Petersburg, Volgograd, Rostov, where they are enrolling volunteers on a contract basis. They promise money for that, and they send them to participate in the military actions in the east of Ukraine. They've started doing it since spring this year, and the only similar structure that managed to form out of the separatist detachments, their own detachments, we are fighting under the emblem of this Русское национальное единство. This emblem is a swastika, somewhat modernized, which is inside the octangular. They are also using the octangular cross, the Orthodox cross, and they have chevrons with not such a swastika, but this is used on their websites, especially where they are calling to participate in military actions. They use the Orthodox cross. Alexander Barkashov, back in March, visited Ukraine with a group of leaders of Russian national unity, then came back again in May, and according to our data, he's still in Ukraine, maybe in Donetsk, and in these special military troops of Russian national unity, his son, Barkashov Younger, is fighting. The second, these are the structures which we consider to be neo-Nazi, and they are also enrolling combatants. They are organizing logistical schemes to transport combatants to the territory of Ukraine along the illegal channels. Unlike the Russian national unity, they don't have their own detachments. They are part of other detachments which fight on the side of pro-Russian forces in Ukraine. The exclusion could be probably is Neo-Kazakh detachments which fight separately, which are used since March when seizing the administrations in different parts of Ukraine. Also, another organization is Eurasian Union of Youth, then the former National Party of Eduard Limonov and Black 100 Черная Сотня, which roots back to the Черная Сотня of the beginning of the 20th century.
It is interesting that some interceptions of the Security Service of Ukraine, by the Security Service of Ukraine, of telephone conversations between militant Alexander Barkashov and Dmitry Boytsov from the Black 100 before the events in Donbass, before the referendum, where Barkashov tells Surkov how many, what should be the percentage in favor of the DNR. We also know from the internet about neo-Nazi Anton Rayevsky, who represented the Black 100, and his connection to Federal Security Service of Russia. He first was sent by Russian special services to Odessa in order to propagate the cause of the potential separatists in Odessa. After his failure, he illegally crossed the border and joined combat actions in Donbass, where he was wounded. The most famous, infamous Eurasian Union of Alexander Dugin. Besides, I would like to know that apart from Russian neo-Nazi groupings, the Russian side also uses neo-Nazis from Europe. This is not for the first time, because who remembers the so-called referendum in the Crimea? Russia then brought international observers, quote-unquote, and our specialist in part, Anton Shekhovtsov, who is a specialist in European neo-Nazi groups, he identified almost 40 persons as members of neo-Nazi groupings from Europe, and also one person who was from radical left grouping in Greece. Besides, now some European neo-Nazis are taking part in the combat actions they are in favor of a strange creation of a Eurasian state from Lisbon to Kamchatka, but without Caucasus and Central Asia. This is a very strange ideology, but it is popular in some neo-Nazi circles who are characterized by Euroscepticism. The Tretий Put, the Third Way organization, and French organization called Jeunesse Identitaire, which means something like young identity carriers who are in favor of the so-called continental unity. There are many professional military among them who took part in the war in Afghanistan. They recently showed a Serb who is a French national who said that they are quite numerous and they are on the side of separatists. There's also a Hungarian legion named after Saint Stephen, and there's information on some militants from Poland and Serbia. If we even just enumerate this number of neo-Nazi groupings from Russia mainly and some other countries, we have to say that all those groupings have not just joined the rebellion in the east of Ukraine. From the very first days of the February events in Ukraine, they took part in destabilizing the situation, not just in Donetsk and Luhansk, but also in Kharkiv, Mykolaiv, and Odessa, where they were spotted and identified by photos by our specialists in right-wing and neo-Nazi groupings. Among other militants who take part in the war on the side of the so-called Luhansk and Donetsk People's Republics, there are some people who are neo-Nazi by their convictions. They are not members of any organizations, but there are quite a lot of them. Ukrainian bloggers perusing their sites and photos and seeing their tattoos and their expressions do identify them as neo-Nazis. Apart from tattoos that they have, they also wear T-shirts with an image of Corneliu Codreanu, who was a leader of the Iron Guard during the World War II. He was a Orthodox fascist, That's why they chose him as their hero. We must say that over the last year, we are facing quite a lot of dilettante accusations of different sides in fascism, ultranationalism, Nazism, and so on. So some sober voices of our experts, like Vyacheslav Likhachov, Andreas Umland, Anton Shekhovtsov, their sober voices and specialist voices are being lost in the sea of accusations of being fascists. And here we should be able to separate and sieve this sea of information, because first Russia was accusing Ukrainians in fascism, then Ukraine started to accuse Russians in fascism. So we think that the tag is devalued now, but for specialists there are no two opinions here, because there are some signs well formulated by a well-known Italian writer Umberto Eco, who was a fascist in his youth, and he has the work which is called 14 Signs of Fascism, which dates back to 1995. So I advise journalists, before they place a tag of fascism or Nazism on someone, please read specialist literature. So we see that on the one side, Russia very often and very broadly applies the designation of fascism to Ukraine. On the other hand, they very broadly use their own neo-Nazi and fascist groupings against Ukraine and under the guidance of their Federal Security Service. So this demands a quick reaction from the world, very well organized specialist materials, and a united front against the fascism and neo-Nazism, which is predominant in Russia now, and the creation of a coalition of peoples, of nations for the democratic choice. Tomorrow, the World Congress of Ukrainians starts, and the day after tomorrow, I'll be speaking there with a suggestion that we create a broad coalition of nations for democratic choice. One of the branches of this work will be our opposition to fascism in Russia. Any questions, I'll be glad to answer. You named several organizations of Nazi organizations in Russian Federation, but are there any signs of Nazism in Russian Federation's politicians' expressions and programs? Unlike Ukraine, the political range in Russia is very much determined by the authorities. There is no alternative ideology there, so maybe you'll find something in Mr. Rogozin's utterance. But the matter is that Russia itself, in contrast to Ukraine, is a very right radical country, chauvinistic country, very much distorted by revanchist ideas, which is, this frustration and revanchism is, according to Umberto Eco, one of the signs of fascism, characteristic features of fascism. If there were free elections in Russia, and I don't think this will happen in the nearest decades, we will probably get a rather huge chunk of fascist ideology on these elections. If we don't talk about official programs, but about actual statements and behavior, how do you evaluate the behavior of a Communist Party and the Liberal Democratic Party? Well, I have told you already, we won't get an adequate political range in Russia because the free elections are not going to happen there. There's a huge mixture of tags and labels, but almost the entire Russia is now contaminated with the virus of revanchism, which is very closely linked to fascism.
Do you have an additional comment? Please say just a few words so that we have time for questions. Thank you. I would like in the beginning to remind that we are 2 steps from one significant date, the 1st of September 1939, 75 years ago, the Second World War started. And we have chances that the Third World War may start. I hope this will not happen. As to fascism, my conviction is that the Fourth Reich is in Moscow now. And the signs of fascism are present in Russia, not in Ukraine, as Russian propaganda says. I will enumerate 4 main signs of fascism. First, that's chauvinism, which is the one race is superstitious over the other. The second is corporate merger of all the branches of power, executive, legislative, together with law enforcement bodies, courts, business elite. That is characteristic for fascism. Third is military expansion against neighbors. These are obvious things which are seen by the whole world. Russia may be thinking of doing the same with Belarus, Kazakhstan, or Baltic states. And fourth is persecution of those who think different. And we see that in Moscow, in St. Petersburg, and other cities of Russia. What else I would like to emphasize? All remember that in the Third Reich, Germans stated that our main enemy are Jews. They started killing, burning, hanging this nation. Today we hear the statements of pseudo-politicians. Such people as Zhirinovsky are not politicians, but they are bandits. That's why I call them pseudo-politicians. They call upon killing Ukrainians, elimination of Ukrainians. That is just like something wild to hear for Russians, normal Russians. And we see the whole chain of logical events taking place on the territory of Ukraine. As Russian mass media state, Russian troops just found themselves incidentally in the east of Ukraine and Crimea. They may incidentally find themselves in Kiev and Warsaw, elsewhere. But I'm absolutely convinced that Russia will not be able to occupy Ukraine, Europe, NATO, and the objective of such neo-fascist state, and I emphasize it, the state, because the majority of Russians, they do not know that they live in a fascist state. I'm talking about the state, not the country. So the objective of that new fascist state, the Kremlin, is to destroy Ukrainian economy. I hope this will not happen. The war will be stopped and everything will be fine. But now the Kremlin uses bluff and blackmail and all other methods so characteristic for new neo-fascism. To counteract this military expansion, the Kremlin propaganda, we decided to set up the organization Stop Fascism, which has the objective to counteract this campaign against Ukraine. That organization is part of the international anti-Putin coalition Stop Fascism in Russia, which includes the organizations from 13 countries. That's opposition in Russia, the activist civil organizations in Ukraine and Baltic states, Israel, Georgia, Poland, Germany, France, Great Britain, the US, and Canada. That is the coalition which has been set up, and I hope it will be expanding, and other countries will join it, and other organizations will join it, and private persons as well, to encourage somehow the most active people and outstanding politicians who participate very actively counteracting this new fascism. We decided to set up the order, which we called for the fight against fascism in Russia. And the first candidate who will receive this order will be the governor of Dnipropetrovsk, Igor Kolomoisky. I am ready to even show this order That is what it looks like. Those who are interested. When will you give it to Mr. Kolomoisky? When will you award it? We're discussing it with his staff when we may have the meeting. I don't think it will take long, maybe in the nearest week or two. We've been expecting for this announcement. And that is what I wanted to share. If you have any questions, you're welcome.
Mr. Herman, will there be conferences, seminars on this important date, the 75th anniversary of the beginning of the Second World War, by your Society of Russian Political Prisoners? Yes, we are planning this. We're planning to stage pickets in St. Petersburg and I think in Warsaw. I hope that we will be able to mark this anniversary in Kiev as well. So this is rather modest at the moment. However, our resistance to fascism is going to grow, and we intend to bring to some capitals in Europe and US and Canada a photo exhibition of crimes of terrorist organizations, DNR and LNR, of their crimes against humanity. Any other questions? I have a question to Mr. Buchov. How do you assess the coalition, the actions of coalition Stop Fascism in Russia, both in Russia and in the eyes of international community? Can you boast of any results? Well, we can say that we can boast nothing at the moment because we have just created the coalition in August. We just announced its formation. We hope for the support of both business and public in order to more actively work in the entire world, not only in Europe and North America, but also in Australia, Africa, Japan. We need some support, so we're going to address everybody who's ready to support our coalition, and we will be holding seminars and conferences, including photo exhibitions in every country where we will think it feasible to work. I have enumerated the countries, and the membership is either individual or of organizations. As I told you, we hope that this coalition will broaden and will manifest itself in its activity. Thank you very much. I thank Mr. Obukhov. Thank you, Mr. Zisels, for helping us to understand the reasons